memory is the residue of thought. Your memory system does not care at all about your motivation in a direct way. This is why, I mean, everyone's experienced this. You remember all kinds of stuff. You don't care whether or not you remember.
Yeah.
And then you want to remember lots of things that you don't remember. And this was actually, you asked earlier what made me want to be a memory researcher. This was the finding, the experiments I saw, the really definitive experiments were conducted in the 60s on this, showing that what people wanted to remember had really just no impact at all on what they remembered.
What's up, Internet? I hope you guys are all having a good day. I'm Simon Young, and I'm the host of the Optimized podcast. We're a podcast part of Simply Neuroscience's podcast branch that seeks to interview scientists and various fitness and health professionals about ways we can be living better lives. In this episode, I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Daniel Willingham, who's a Harvard alumnus and currently is a professor at the University of Virginia. He's very well known in his field for all the research he does on learning and studying. And he's recently published a book called Outsmart Your Brain, which I would highly recommend checking out if you're a student right now. In this episode, we talked about some various study methods a lot of students use that don't work. And we also talked about some science-based ways we can be studying better. If you're trying to make it through school in one piece right now, I would highly recommend checking out this episode. There are timestamps linked on the video if you want to skip to anything in particular, or if you plan on watching the whole podcast, that would also be greatly appreciated. I hope you enjoy. All right, Dr. Daniel Willingham, thanks for coming on.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. So the first question I've got is, so you research a lot of learning at the University of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, how do you get interested in that field and what keeps you going in it?
Yeah, my career's actually taken a funny turn. So I went to graduate school not that clear on what I wanted to study, which everyone will tell you is not the way to be admitted to graduate school and is a bad plan. Like, you should, if you don't really know what you want to study, you probably need to gain some more experience. But no one told me that. So I applied to graduate school and I'm like, hey, I'm Dan. I think it would be really fun to study cognitive psychology. And was admitted and had a fantastic advisor who had pretty broad interests herself. And she had done some, not quite visual psychophysics, but she had done some vision work. She'd done lots of work in attention. She also had interests in learning. And so as soon as I got there, she said, I'm going to put you on a project that I'm working on. And then I also want you to be thinking about what you're interested in. So I just sort of got swept along and found myself very interested by the experiments and learning that she was conducting. But my career took a big turn about 10 years post PhD when I got interested in applications of memory theory and experimental work, namely in education, both in K-12 and in higher education. So that's really been my primary focus since about 2007.
2007?
Yeah.
That's been a long time in the field, right?
I'm old. Yeah. So
all right.
I've been around a long time. By 2007, I was already 17 years post PhD. So yeah.
Oh, dang.
Yeah.
That's cool. So you went to Harvard for graduate school, right?
I did. And that was actually my second graduate school. I transferred for reasons unrelated to the program, but I just described my advisor. That was at the University of Minnesota.
How's it been in the learning fields, Like what do you like the most about it? What, your job?
Yeah. I mean, they're kind of two separate questions. You said your job sort of at the end. I mean, I think of the particular job I have being in academia as quite, you can obviously be a learning researcher and not be a college professor.
Mm-hmm.
I think I like studying learning because it's everywhere. I mean, wherever there are human beings, learning is taking place. And so there's some aspect of it that is applicable to and of interest to everybody. So that's, I think, what's always captivated me. And then the reason I chose to work at a university, I'm actually a little bit unusual. Most of the people who were in the lab with me, both in Minnesota and at Harvard, did not end up in academia. Most of them went into industry jobs of one sort or another. But I stayed in academia. I really like sort of pursuing whatever problems interest me at the time, and academia allows you to do that in a way that that industry doesn't. And you can take a very long view as well. You can work on something knowing I may contribute something to a problem, but never really solve it.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like, I'll make some little steps towards it, but I think the problem itself is interesting. And, there are people who would, of course, hear that description and think that sounds horrible. Like, I like to solve problems, not chip away at them and be uncertain as to whether or not I'm really making any headway. But that's just sort of a matter of personality, I think.
Yeah, I hear a lot of scientists get into the field. They want to like help people. They want to do good. And then by the time they end their career, they've written a bunch of papers, but they haven't really seen like the fruit of their vision. Like
another professor put it that way to me when I was sort of mid-career. He said, when I was in mid-career, I realized at some point, I've published 100 papers. And if I keep going the way I've been going, by the time I retire, I'll have 200 papers. And like, is that really what I want? Or do I want to try and do something where, as you said, like you sort of see the fruits of your labor much more in a much more direct way? That honestly was, even though I went into the applied work, that wasn't really on my mind. It was much more, I think I really have something to contribute here. And this is something I can do. And it's sort of an opportunity, and someone ought to do it. So let me try it and see whether I like it and whether I'm good at it and it works out.
It looks like it's been going pretty well for you so far, right?
Without false modesty. Yeah, this is, I feel like this is what this is what I've been doing the last
your calling
15 years. Yeah, my calling. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's nice. I think that's apt.
That's cool. All right, so I guess we're gonna segue into our second question, and so your book is a lot about study methods, some that do work and some that don't. And in your book, you bring up some popular study methods like highlighting and rereading your notes that really aren't so effective. So do you think you could bust some really common studying methods that a lot of students use that the science doesn't support?
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned two of them that are probably the most common. Most students, when they read, if they can, they will highlight the book. And it's easy to see why that seems like a good idea. Most students have a lot of reading to do. And so you're going to have to revisit this text in some way. You're not going to commit it to memory on that first reading. So you're trying to kind of reduce the amount of work you have to do. When I come back to the text, I know I can focus on what I'm highlighting. There is also a feeling that something about doing the highlighting like helps maybe cement it into memory. I've heard that from students as well. The biggest problem with highlighting is that you're not very likely to highlight what's really important. And when you reflect on it for a moment, it makes sense. If you're a novice in whatever it is you're reading, you don't understand the content very well. You're trying to understand and learn it. And so you're making this judgment about what's important and what's less important. But you're really in no position to make that judgment yet. After you've learned the content, then you'll be in a much better position. So highlighting does make sense, if you're in a field where you have some expertise. So if you're, say, a graduate student in neuroscience and you're a few years in, you're probably quite adept at reading papers in your field, and highlighting is going to be fine for you. It's going to make sense. But if you're a first-year graduate student, or you're an undergraduate and you're reading a paper that's like not in your major or something, then you're very susceptible to that problem. The second study technique that you mentioned is rereading. And this is the number one method that, at least the surveys are all American students, so I don't know whether it's common elsewhere. My suspicion is it probably is. But we know from surveys it's the most common study method in the US. And rereading your notes and rereading the textbook is actually bad in two ways. One way it's bad is that it's just not very good for getting content into memory. If your goal is to learn things for, in preparation for a quiz or an exam, it's just not nearly as effective as other methods of memorization, because we all have had the experience of, you're supposedly reading something and you get to the bottom of the page and you realize you've been thinking about lunch the whole time and you have no idea what you just read. And what this says is, for people who are good readers, you can so supposedly read something. What you're really doing is you're kind of decoding it, and maybe you're subvocally saying the words, but you're not really processing meaning. And processing meaning is what you need to do in order for something to stick to memory. So that's one way that rereading is bad, but rereading is actually a double whammy. There's another way that rereading is bad. It makes you feel like you're learning. So it tricks you into thinking that you're mastering the content. And the way it does that is it increases fluency and familiarity. So as you're reading, here's an analogy for you. Suppose that you go to a lecture. Suppose I come to your school and I give a talk. And I give a talk about like how to study or something. And then everyone says, oh, Dan Willingham's coming again the next day. We're all going to go down to the auditorium and listen. And you come and sit down, and I start giving the exact same talk. I'm like sentence for sentence, same little spontaneous jokes and all that. Your thinking would not be, oh, this is great. Look, here's another chance for me to revisit this content. Now I'm really going to learn it well. You would think, this is ridiculous. I already heard this. Right? And the reason you feel like you already heard it is it's very familiar, right? You're listening, you're like, yeah, right. I know all this. I heard all this. But the truth is, you don't know it to the point that, if Willingham left, you could get up and give the lecture. You don't actually know the content in that way. Instead, you're recognizing it. And recognizing something is not the same as being able to talk about it yourself. And that's a common problem that students have. They get confused. It's basically a criterion of learning. What does it mean to know something? And they sort of feel like if someone else is explaining it, or if I'm reading it and it makes sense, then I know it. But that's not really the criterion you want to work with. The criterion should be, I can explain it to somebody else. So rereading, that's the second way in which rereading is bad. It leads to that feeling of familiarity, that feeling of, yes, I've experienced this, of course, before. And of course you have, but that doesn't mean you're able to explain it. And that's what you need to be able to do.
All right. So I hear like recognition versus recall. That's one theme I've heard, right? So what are some like good study methods to use in place of the ones that only involve recognition?
Yeah, there are a few things that we've learned from the lab that have been tested in real educational situations that have proven to be very robust principles. So one principle is that probing memory is actually a good way to cement things into memory. It's superior to studying. So quizzing yourself, people who are studying will quiz themselves, but they're really quizzing themselves to see whether or not they're ready to stop studying. They're not quizzing themselves as a way of learning. And quizzing yourself is actually a really good way of learning. It's harder. It's harder than studying. because you have to sit there and like dig around in memory and see if you can remember stuff. But there's something about digging around in memory that actually is good for fixing things into memory that were there, but were kind of fragile. Another thing that's really good for memory is spacing out your practice, especially if you have bouts of sleep between your practice. Anything, and the third thing I'll mention is that anything you can do to think about the meaning of what you're trying to remember. So organizing things in terms of its meaning, sort of drawing examples, explaining to somebody else, even if somebody else is an imaginary person, sort of teaching an imaginary person. All of these things are very effective because they're getting you to think about meaning. So what I say in the book is the easiest way to structure this, telling someone think about meaning, is it's actually kind of a hard directive to follow. So what I tell people in the book to do is to develop a really comprehensive study guide that you, and this is critical, that you build yourself. You don't want to, use materials that you find on the internet, even if they're supposedly specific to the course that you're taking, because I've looked at the materials that are available on websites for the courses that I teach, and the materials are frequently awful. They're outdated. They're just downright incorrect. But the more important thing is that creating your own study materials is actually studying. A lot of times people think that this is like, it's just like work you have to do that will enable you to get to the real business of studying. So if I find a Quizlet or something online that's specific to the course, then I'm saving time. But creating your own Quizlet, thinking to yourself, what are the really important ideas here? How am I going to structure these questions? What are the themes of the course? And I want to, create questions about that. All of that is terrific for memory. So there's no reason to skip over that. So I say create your own large comprehensive study guide and create it in question and answer format so that you're able to capitalize on that principle I mentioned before of probing memory. And then finally, you need, ideally, you'll be skilled enough in planning your schedule that you can do this far enough in advance that you can spread out your studying and take advantage of space practice a little bit.
All right. So space repetition and a lot of like probing your memory. So you think for most students, like a deck of flashcards would be a good way to pull that off?
A deck of flashcards, yeah. I mean, it's very old school, but it's effective. Yeah, and flashcard, physical flashcards are fine. If you're using an app, they all enable you to randomize. Randomizing is helpful also, seeing them in random order.
All right. That's cool. So the next question I've got is one strategy you include in the book is rewriting your notes into a hierarchy. So I think you touched a little bit on this before, that it sort of forces you to like reevaluate your own thoughts and put the ideas in like your own terms and understandings. So what do you think it is about this hierarchy, like organizing notes into a hierarchy, that makes us understand them better?
Yeah, it's not just, it's part of its understanding, and part of there's a little more to it though as well. First, let me say that what I'm talking about is like after you've been in class, you've taken notes, ideally that same day or maybe the next day, you will look at your notes and reorganize them. People generally are kind of resistant to this idea. So let me try and make a pitch for why it's actually worth your time. Most lectures that you go to, and this is like starting in middle school and definitely through high school and college, they're organized hierarchically. So you come in, it's like there's a theme for the day. So if you're in my class, it's like today we're going to talk about long-term memory. There are 6 things that I want you to know about long-term memory. And then, so there's sort of a main topic, and then there's usually between 3 and 7 main points for the day. And then for each main point, in my class, it's like there'll be a couple of experiments that illustrate that point. There'll be an example from daily life. There'll be a cartoon I found, a few different things.
Mm.
So that's what I mean by hierarchically organized. And so we'll go through all that. And then, with each experiment, there are, of course, details of the experiment. And then we'll move on to point number 2.
Mm.
The key thing about a hierarchy like that is that those subpoints are all related to one of the main conclusions for the day, but they're really distributed in time. Like I may cover the main point, the first main point. It may take me 10, 15 minutes to do that. So the things I'm saying at the beginning are related to the stuff at the end, but they're separated in time by 10 minutes. Nevertheless, those connections are very important to me, the instructor. And likewise, when I'm talking about details of an experiment, those are all related. The reason I think those are so important is they have this causal relationship to the conclusion, that the details matter because the way they did the experiment is why they're able to draw the conclusion they were able to draw.
Mm-hmm.
So it's crucial that you understand those connections. It's easy to get caught up in the details and think I got to get down all the details. And you do need to get down all the details, but you also need to know what they mean. Getting all of that on the fly is really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just that there's a lot of information, it's that connections that you're supposed to make, that the instructor thinks you're going to make, those connections may be separated by 10 or 15 minutes. And that's really hard to work out. Now, a good instructor will make that easier for you because you'll come in, they'll say, okay, now we're going to talk about the crash of the stock market. There are basically 3 reasons the stock market was ripe for a crash. And then later they'll say, okay, now that's reason number 2. Now let me tell you reason number 3 that the stock market. So they'll do this sort of they'll give you these verbal signposts that tell you what the organization is. If the instructor is not that good, they won't do that. And it's wholly on you to recognize, oh, okay, I guess that's reason number 2 is over. And now he's talking about reason number 3, right? Let alone whether you're going to recognize, oh, he's still talking about the stock market crash, right? If you don't have an instructor who's doing that kind of signposting, it gets very hard for you to figure out the organization. Even if the instructor's helping, and even if you're pretty good at this, you're gonna miss some of it. And this is why I say you have to reorganize your notes, and that ideally the same day. All it entails is go through, figure out what were the main ideas of the day. And again, there's usually in a typical 50 to 75 minute class, there are going to be between 3 and 7 main points of the day. Figure out what the main points were. And you can usually figure those out because the instructor will repeat them. You will also see from their body language and their voice that this is a big deal. Like this is, one of the big things for the day. So identify those as you're reorganizing your notes, identify those. And then every other idea in the lecture that you captured in your notes, figure out which main conclusion does this relate to and how does it relate? Is this an example of the main conclusion? Is this a result of it? Is this something that is it evidence for it? Something like that. So that organization is important. And I know this is a long answer, sorry, but we're bringing it home now. This was, you asked, how does doing this sort of help with meaning making? And I think that's probably clear, but I also want to highlight the other thing it will do is it will expose things that you didn't capture in your notes. So it'll help you realize, he talked for 10 minutes about this experiment. It's obviously important. I'm not certain which main idea it relates to. And so that will alert you that, you need to figure this out. You need to ask the instructor or ask somebody else what's going on. So it'll help you figure out what you don't know as well.
I also feel like actually rewriting your notes can help you like make the information your own, right? You have to
It
like,
can.
yeah.
It can. I mean, some people really like doing that. If you go on YouTube and just like look at videos of like how to study, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of people will talk about rewriting their notes. A lot of people will, and there are all these videos about like how to make your notes beautiful and like boxes you can put around in different colors and all that. From a memory perspective, that may or may not help. It's a lot like rereading, right? This is rewriting. And so the
Mm-hmm.
question is, are you actually thinking or are you essentially taking dictation when you rewrite your notes? I can rewrite stuff and think about something else. And
Mm-hmm.
that's obviously not going to do it.
All right. So to actually rewrite your notes effectively, you've actually got to process them, and you've got to like put them down in hierarchies and make them your own. Right.
Exactly. I mean, and this
All
is
right.
why in the book, in general, cognitive psychologists are not very big fans of things where mental tasks that you set for yourself
Mm.
that where there's not a lot of structure, because when there's not a lot of structure to the task, that's when your mind wanders. So if you
Mm.
tell someone, I want you to, recopy these notes, but don't just copy them, like really think. The really think sort of counts on me to constantly tell myself, oh, I'm supposed to be really thinking.
Mm-hmm.
If on the other hand, I say, your task is to take these notes that you wrote out and create a mind map or create a tree diagram,
Mm-hmm.
then that's a much more structured task. But critically, it can't be completed unless you're thinking about meaning. You have to think about what things mean in order to
Mm.
complete the task. So if you're staying on task, you're thinking about meaning.
All right. So it sounds like practice tests, flashcards, and restructuring notes. Actually thinking about meaning is,
Those can all be good. I mean,
yeah.
you do have to be careful about practice tests. If they're not provided by the
Yeah,
instructor,
yeah.
again, I'd worry about that. And the other thing is, like, take practice tests. One of the things that my students do a lot is they don't take practice tests as a way of studying. They take
Mm-hmm.
practice tests to see if they're done. And so if anytime you take a test, there's a certain amount of luck in it. Do the questions happen to probe stuff that you know? And so if
Mm-hmm.
you take a practice test and you kind of get lucky, you're going to have misinformation about what you actually know. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you get a 90 on a practice test, you're probably going to say, oh God, I'm good to go. Like I'm not studying anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that you're going to get a 90 on the test that's coming,
Mm-hmm.
the real test.
Yeah. All right. So practice tests shouldn't just be used as like a week before the exam review thing. They should be like actively like made part of every person's study plan.
They should, well, again, it depends on whether not everybody has access to them. So
Yeah,
it
yeah.
depends on whether you have access to them. I would say like, yeah, use that as a source of questions.
Mm.
I think if you can get old exams, it's great to have some sense of what does this instructor like to ask? Like
Mm-hmm.
what level of detail are the questions? I think it's really useful for that. But
Mm.
as a way of studying, it's fine as like one component of a number of other things you're doing. But don't use it as a way of judging whether or not you're ready for the exam. The way you should judge whether you're ready for the exam is if
Mm-hmm.
you really created a comprehensive study guide.
Mm.
How are you at answering everything that's on your study guide?
All right. All right, thanks. And also you talk a little bit in your book about how you compare like learning in kindergarten to learning in high school, where if you don't learn well in kindergarten, it's on the teacher, but if you don't learn well in high school, it's on you.
Yeah.
So there's kind of like an expectation for students to know how to study, even
Yeah.
though they've never been taught how to study. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, this is, never mind high school. And high school teachers still
Mm-hmm.
feel kind of bad and they still take some of the heat
Yeah.
but once you're in college, then it's really game over. Like college professors just figure like, look, I served it up. Like if you didn't learn it, I'm not responsible in the least. But yeah, I mean, the reason I was going into that was making the point that there's just no independence expected at all of kids when they're in
Mm-hmm.
pre-K, which of course seems totally appropriate to us.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a great deal of independence expected of high school students, especially by grade 12. But what I was highlighting is nobody teaches in between those years. No one's teaching anybody how to
Yeah.
study, how to take notes, how to plan your schedule, how to deal with anxiety, how to avoid procrastination. All of those things you're just kind of magically expected to know how to do. And, we know from surveys, most people don't know how to do them.
Yeah. That's a problem then, isn't it? That if we're expecting our like kids to study all this coursework and they're still like spending hours re-highlighting. I mean, just
It's a
like,
huge problem. And I mean, we
yeah.
saw this. This is, of course, not the only problem during the pandemic, but it was a contributor people didn't talk about. I mean, people, of course, there was enormous problems with anxiety, and there was difficult, teachers were sort of in emergency mode trying to figure out how to teach remotely. But part of the problem, too, is that students were being asked to be independent in their learning in a
Mm-hmm.
way they never had before. It was like really amped up, and
Mm.
they didn't have the mental tools. They didn't know how to do it.
All right. So, do you think we need to restructure the school program? Or how do you think?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not a complete restructure,
Yeah.
but the kinds of stuff I'm talking about, people talk about like, should there be a study skills class?
Mm.
And my answer is probably not a
Mm-hmm.
class. It really needs to be woven into the whole curriculum, because different demands start at different ages.
All right.
If you just think about like, what's the first age? What's the age at which we're sending kids home, not with, stories to read where things are in a narrative structure, but like a textbook to read, which is in a different format.
Mm-hmm.
Your kids are expected to do different things with that text. They're not just reading it for pleasure. They're expected to learn something new and commit it to memory.
Mm-hmm.
Do they, the first time you're asking them to do that, you have to ask yourself, do they know how to engage that with a text like that? The
Mm-hmm.
first time they're given a quiz, do they know how to commit things to memory? Do they know how to judge whether or not they've committed something to memory? So
Mm-hmm.
as these different demands come online in the curriculum, those demands ought to be supported with instruction.
All right. So, do you think there should be some level of teaching good study methods in school?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, that definitely should. And I mean, it has to start with this being part of teacher preparation, because teachers don't know this. Why would
Mm.
they? They weren't taught it either.
Yeah. You've also this is a little bit of a related topic. I've seen some of your articles on learning styles
Yeah.
and how in the state of New York in particular, teachers have to know learning styles. But
Yeah, it's like part of teacher certification in a
mhm.
number of states. It was an article in Education Next, I think it
Mhm.
was. It's a few years ago. It was like 45 states have some mention of learning
Mm.
styles in their standards. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, generally uh this was an article published a while ago, but generally you don't support the idea of learning styles
Simon,
as
I've
like
written on this so many
yeah,
times
yeah.
and so
I've seen a lot
many
of
I
this.
want to kill myself.
Yeah,
I keep
I don't want
telling
to
myself,
like I don't
I
want to
keep,
like force you to repeat yourself
no,
if you've
it's
already
fine.
said
It's
it a
fine.
ton,
It's
but
fine.
just like a quick rundown cuz
No, and I
I feel
wasn't
like
complaining to you,
okay,
really. I was
I just
just
feel
like,
like a lot of our listeners they still like subscribe to this
I
and
know. I just wanted pity. That's all I
if
wanted,
I'm
Simon.
lucky,
So,
okay.
not
Well,
pity, but anyway, yeah, no.
yeah.
But so you're right. I did the first time I wrote about it. So I'll tell a brief story. It was like very early on when I was, just sort of transitioning away from being a research
Mhm.
psychologist, doing basic research on learning and memory, to talking to teachers. And I was talking to this a small group of teachers, like 30 or something. And I
Mhm.
used learning styles as an example of an obviously wrong theory, because I
Mhm.
assumed everybody knew that this was an old idea. And the teachers were like confused, and a few were outraged.
Mhm.
And they were like, wait, go back a slide. What are you talking about? That there's no such thing as learning styles. So it is. So very briefly, for
Mhm.
your listeners who aren't familiar with this idea, learning styles, the idea is that the important thing that people frequently get confused is they confuse it with ability, and they think like visual learners means you're good at learning visual things.
Mhm.
And it doesn't really mean that, because everybody already agrees that different people have different abilities, and some
Mhm.
people are better with language and some people are better with numbers.
Mhm.
So that's no great surprise. The styles idea is supposed to be that there's flexibility in that. So I'm not just better at dealing with language, but when something comes to me that I want to learn that isn't in a language format, if I turn it into a language format, then I'm going to be more successful in learning. These theories have been around at least since the 50s. That was kind of their heyday. And then they didn't really pan out experimentally. And then they had a comeback in the 70s where people thought maybe this will be a good idea in teaching children who've been diagnosed with a learning disability. But then that didn't really work out either. And so researchers lost interest because it was like, there were a bunch of these theories. None of them were panning out. Like, why would you keep testing them? And we could speculate about why this is. They continue to be very, very popular among educators, and they're widely believed. And everywhere throughout the world that people have looked, researchers have gotten interested in finding out whether everybody believes in learning styles. And belief is generally around 90%, not only in the US and Canada, but also in Western Europe and Central America, South America. I'm trying to think of the other. It's been tested in a number of different places, and belief is always around 90%. But the experiment to test whether or not this idea is right is very simple. If you take, for example, verbal learners versus visual learners, you just give people some experience, like a story, that's either matches their style or doesn't match their style. So you show them a silent movie if they're a visual learner, or you read them a story if they're supposed to be an auditory learner. And either the input matches or doesn't match their style. And then later you give some test, either a memory test or how well they understood the story, something like that. And you should see better performance when style matches what the person's style is supposed to be. And that's the experiment where over and over again, we don't see any evidence.
Yeah, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
All right. So for our listeners, the takeaway should just be like,
don't worry about it.
Just don't worry about it.
Yeah.
All right. And unfortunately, because Zoom limits us, we've only got 5 minutes left.
Okay.
But so the last question is hopefully a pretty nice one. But
so the pressure's on. Okay.
Yeah, pressure. Yeah, I see like the clock ticking down in the upper. Yeah, but I can't. All right. So out of everything you've learned in your lab so far, like out of absolutely everything you've done in your years of research, if you could only have one key takeaway and you had to forget absolutely everything else, what do you think you would have that one key takeaway be?
That memory follows thought.
Memory follows thought.
Yeah. And so the way I've put it in a couple of different books that I've written is memory is the residue of thought. Your memory system does not care at all about your motivation in a direct way. This is why, I mean, everyone's experienced this. You remember all kinds of stuff. You don't care whether or not you remember. Yeah. And then you want to remember lots of things that you don't remember. And this was actually, you asked earlier what made me want to be a memory researcher. This was the finding, the experiments I saw, the really definitive experiments were conducted in the 60s on this, showing that what people wanted to remember had really just no impact at all on what they remembered. And I was so taken by that. I think because as a student, I had been like, for the previous 14 years, like trying to jam stuff into my memory. And I couldn't believe that desire didn't really count for anything. So that's what I would, that's what doesn't matter. But what does matter is whatever it is you're thinking about. And that's what I would, that would be the one finding I would retain.
All right. Sounds good. All right. I guess that's all. That's pretty much all Zoom's going to let us have for today. So,
sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks for coming on. Dr. Daniel Willingham, his book Outsmart Your Brain is out now, hopefully at a bookstore near you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.